They live in sweet harmony there. My heart is now set on that city, and someday its blessing I'll share. In that bright city, pearly white city, I have a mansion, a robe, and a crown. Now I am watching, waiting, and longing for the white city John saw coming down. Be seated, please. The song we'll use tonight for an invitation song will be number 337.
Good evening. It's good to see you all with us this evening. Glad to have such a good crowd with us. If you would be turning to Judges chapter 6 and 7. That's where we'll spend the majority of our time this evening. So if you will be turning there, you can follow along with the lesson tonight. In his book, Living Above the Level of Mediocrity, Chuck Swindoll tells about a church in the Soviet Union during the days of the Iron Curtain that was forced to meet secretly because house church services were illegal. These people tried to be as secret as possible as they gathered on Sunday to worship the Lord. So they came at different times and they casually entered the house until everyone had finally arrived. Then they would lock the doors, pull the curtains shut, and quietly worship the Lord. But one Lord's Day, right in the middle of their worship, two soldiers broke into the house, and at gunpoint they commanded these Christians to line up against the wall. Then they told them that they had a choice. They could either deny Christ and leave, or they could stay and suffer the consequences. Several of them left in quite a hurry. The soldiers waited a few moments, which seemed like an eternity to those who were still in the room. The soldiers said, "This is your last chance. You either deny your faith in Jesus Christ, or you can stay and suffer the consequences." Another one left, and then another, almost hiding their faces as if they were ashamed. But there remained a few people, their children standing beside them, trembling in fear and crying. After everyone had left that chose to leave, the soldiers closed the doors, turned to those who remained, and said, "Let's praise our God." The soldiers explained that sometime earlier that they had been sent to another one of these house churches to arrest Christians there. But in the process, they'd heard the gospel and accepted Jesus as their Lord and Savior. But they explained to these Christians that had stayed, and they said, "We've learned that you can't trust anybody who's afraid to be true to his faith." The story of Gideon found here in Judges chapter 6 and 7 is a great example of an ordinary man who faced fear but was able to overcome that fear with God's help. He learned to trust God and became a man of great courage. And that's what I want to talk about tonight, learning to trust God. I've preached from this text before in Judges chapter 6, but I think there's many different things that we can learn from this text. And also tonight, I want to add on some things from Judges chapter 7 as well. There are 3 points in Gideon's life that I want to point out tonight and look at. The first one is I want us to look at the task that God gave Gideon. And the second point, I want us to look at the test that Gideon had for God. And the final point I want to look at is the trust that Gideon learned to have in God. So starting off, we look at the task from God that was given to Gideon. The story begins with an angel appearing to Gideon to give him this fearful task of leading the Israelites into battle against these Midianites. These Midianites were ruthless people who came in swarms to terrorize the Israelites. They invaded their land, they stole their crops and their cattle, and they burned their homes. Chapter 6, verse 5 says, "For they would come up with their livestock in their tents, coming in as numerous as locusts. Both they and their camels were without number, and they would enter the land to destroy it." And this, of course, is talking about the Midianites. Gideon was afraid because of this. He was afraid because of the Midianites. Verse 11 tells us that he was threshing wheat at the bottom of a winepress in order to hide the grain from the Midianites. Wheat was usually threshed above ground where the wind could blow away the chaff. But Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress, which was a large hole in the ground. And he was doing this to keep the Midianites from seeing him and to keep the Midianites from stealing his grain. Gideon was scared. While Gideon was down there, we read about a conversation that happens in verses 12 through 15. It says, "And the angel of the Lord appeared to him and said to him, 'The Lord is with you, you mighty man of valor.' Gideon said to him, 'O my Lord, if the Lord is with us, why then has all this happened to us? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, Did not the Lord bring us up from Egypt? But now the Lord has forsaken us and delivered us into the hands of the Midianites.' Then the Lord turned to him and said, 'Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Have I not sent you?' So he said to him, 'O my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, my clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house.' The angel of the Lord appeared to him and said, 'Mighty hero, the Lord is with you.' Gideon replied, 'If the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us?'" Sometimes we, like Gideon, think just because we feel inadequate that we're exempt from involvement. In fact, we sometimes like to think that our lack of confidence impresses God because we think that we're being humble. However, that's not what humility is. Humility is not a low self-image. Humility is discovering those gifts that God has given you and using those gifts for His glory rather than for your own. God's given the task here to Gideon to save the Israelites from the Midianites. And God gives Gideon some comfort in verse 16. Verse 16 says, "And the Lord said to him, Surely I will be with you, and you shall defeat the Midianites as one man." We see this many times throughout the Bible. God plus one equals a majority. That's true even in the case of the one on God's side being weak and uncertain. I'm reminded of people like Noah, people like Moses. I'm reminded of people like David. When God is on your side, you have all you need. In this instance, in Judges chapter 6, God was going to use one man, which was Gideon, to save his people. So we see here the task that God has given to Gideon. In the second point, we see Gideon's test for God. Gideon wasn't convinced when God said, "I'm going to be with you." So in verse 17, he asked, "If now I have found favor in your sight, then show me a sign that it is you who talks with me." And of course, God does. When Gideon placed his offering of meat and bread on the rock before the angel took the tip of his staff and touched the sacrifice, and fire flared from the rock and consumed it all. Then the angel disappeared, and Gideon exclaimed in verse 22, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." So God performs this miracle for Gideon, trying to give Gideon that faith and that trust. God also told Gideon to prepare another offering. Look now at verse 25. "Now it came to pass the same night that the Lord said to him, Take your father's young bull, The second bull is 7 years old, and tear down the altar of Baal that your father has, and cut down the Asherah that is beside it, and build an altar to the Lord your God on top of this rock in the proper arrangement. And take the second bull and offer a burnt sacrifice with the wood of the image which you shall cut down. This Asherah pole that it talks about here, this image that it talks about, when it was placed next to an altar of Baal, it indicated that this was a place of pagan prostitution. So God was instructing Gideon here to destroy the symbols of idolatry, destroy the symbols of immorality, and to burn that wooden image as a message that time had come for repentance. Verse 27 says, So Gideon took 10 men from among his servants and did as the Lord said to him. But because he feared his father's household and the men of the city too much to do it by day, he did it by night. So Gideon does as the Lord commands. He does it at night while everyone is asleep. But the next morning when the people in the city found out what he had done, they were upset, and they went to Gideon's father, and they said, Where's Gideon? We've come to kill him. Joash, Gideon's father, was a courageous man. We see his courage here. Although this was his own altar and his own image that was set up that Gideon had destroyed, Joash seems to be the first person to truly repent and turn back to the Lord. Looking at verse 31, it says, But Joash said to all who stood against him, Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. If he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. You see the courage that Joash has to stand up to these people, to stand up and say, if this God, if this Baal is real, then he'll take care of it himself. We don't have to do anything. And courage can be contagious. One person standing up against evil can inspire others to do the same thing. And these people, they needed to be inspired. Because if you look at verse 33, it says, Then all the Midianites, the Amalekites, the people of the east gathered together, and they crossed over and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. These people were coming to battle the Israelites. They were going to need this courage in order to defeat them. After these people came over and camped in the valley of Jezreel, the Spirit of the Lord came upon Gideon. And Gideon sent messengers all over northern Israel, calling people together with him. And to Gideon's amazement, 32,000 men responded. They all came to Gideon, and they were all ready to fight. All they needed was somebody to lead them, and that somebody was going to be Gideon. You know, it's a sobering thought in your life as a leader when you realize that people are following me. People are listening to what I say. People are doing what I ask them to do. It makes you feel like you're making a difference, and you are making a difference when people are listening to what you say. And this is what Gideon was feeling at this time. This is his time to become a leader and to trust in God. However, Gideon was still afraid, so he asked God for yet another sign. Look with me at verses 36 and 37. Gideon said to God, If you will save Israel by my hand as you have said, look, I shall put a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece only, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand as you have said. So what happens? The very next morning, God answers Gideon's request. Gideon wrung out a bowl full of water from that fleece. But Gideon still had second thoughts. You look at verse 39. Then Gideon said to God, Do not be angry with me, but let me speak just once more. Let me test, I pray, just once more with the fleece. Let it now be dry on the fleece, but on all the ground let there be dew. In other words, Gideon's saying, reverse the process just to prove that this was truly a miracle. Verse 40 says, And God did so that night. It was dry on the fleece only, but there was dew on all the ground. There was no mistake here. God was truly with Gideon. So we've seen the task given to Gideon by God, and we see the test that Gideon gives to God. In the final point, I want us to look at the trust that Gideon learns to have in God. It was finally time for Gideon to demonstrate his trust in God. Moving into chapter 7, we look at the first 2 verses. It says, Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the well of Herod. So the camp of the Midianites was on the north side of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. And the Lord said to Gideon, The people who are with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into their hands, lest Israel claim glory for itself against me, saying, My own hand has saved me. So God says, I'm gonna narrow down this army, because if I don't, then you're gonna think you did this on your own. God's idea is, if I narrow this army down to where you have no chance to win, and then you win with me on your side, you'll realize that I'm truly with you. Let me condense this next part of the story for you. God told Gideon, he says, you don't need a powerful military. He says you need a confident spirit. So God says, let's begin to trim down your troops. Tell them that anyone trembling with fear may go home. So Gideon tells the men this, and 22,000 went home. Imagine what Gideon must have been thinking at this point. Over 2/3 of his army is gone now. That must have been devastating for Gideon. But God said to Gideon after this, he said, there's still too many. Gideon's probably thinking, what do you mean? I just lost 2/3 of my army. There's no way I can win. But God says, there's still too many. Take them down to the water, and I'll sift them out there. God says, when they get to the water, watch how they drink, and send back those who kneel down at the water to drink. He says, the ones who lift the water to their mouths and lap it from their hands, those are the ones you keep. And only 300 men lap the water from their hands. Verse 7 in chapter 7 says, Then the Lord said to Gideon, By the 300 men who lapped, I will save you, and deliver the Midianites into your hand. Let all the people go, every man to his place. Only 300 out of 32,000 remained. But Gideon still did as God said. He sent the others home. Now I want us to notice 2 things Gideon did that helped him to conquer his fear. The first thing he did was he trusted God completely. He'd seen enough to be convinced that God was truly with him. And that's what God asks of us too. Jesus tells us, Therefore do not worry, saying, What shall we eat, or what shall we drink, or what shall we wear? We read that in Matthew 6, verse 31. How many years does God have to provide for us before we're convinced that He's truly going to supply our needs? Gideon realized, God's going to supply my needs. God's going to take care of me. He trusted God completely. The second thing I want to realize here is that Gideon was obedient. When God instructed him to go, he went, even though he was still afraid. Courage isn't necessarily the absence of fear, but courage is being afraid and proceeding anyways. Looking now at verses 9 through 11, it says, It happened on the same night that the Lord said to him, Arise, go down against the camp, for I have delivered it into your hand. But if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hands shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp. Gideon didn't say, Lord, that's not necessary. Instead, that night, he and his servant sneaked down to the edge of that enemy's camp, where they overheard 2 of the enemy soldiers discussing an odd dream. And we read of that dream in verses 13 and 14. It says, When Gideon had come, there was a man telling a dream to his companion. He said, "I've had a dream. To my surprise, a loaf of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian. It came to a tent so that it fell and overturned, and the tent collapsed." Then his companion answered and said, "This is nothing else but the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, the man of Israel. Into his hand God has delivered Midian and the whole camp." So even this Midianite soldier, he realizes we don't have a chance against God. These people know who God is too. It's not just the people of Israel. They know the power of God. In verses 15 through 18, we finally see Gideon becoming the leader that God had always wanted him to be. It says, "And so it was when Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation that he worshipped. He returned to the camp of Israel and said, 'Arise, for the Lord has delivered the camp of Midian into your hand.' Then he divided the 300 men into 3 companies, and he put a trumpet into every man's hand, with empty pitchers and torches inside the pitchers. And he said to them, 'Look at me and do likewise. Watch, and when I come to the edge of the camp, you shall do as I do. When I blow the trumpet, I and all who are with me, then you also blow the trumpets on every side of the whole camp, and say, the sword of the Lord and of Gideon.'" I want us to stop here for just a moment and notice 3 essentials of an effective leader that we see here in Gideon. The first thing is reassuring confidence. Gideon says, "We're going to do it. We're going to go defeat these people." He gives the people confidence. A leader gives their followers confidence. The second thing is there's clear communication. Gideon says, "This is exactly what you're supposed to do." And a leader, that's what a leader does. He tells his followers exactly what to do. And finally, from Gideon, we see a positive example. He says, "Do as I do." And that's the greatest thing a leader can do, is lead by example. Do as I do. Gideon had finally become the mighty warrior that God wanted him to be. So the Israelites, they silently surround this Midianite camp. And at a given signal, all 300 of the men smash those pitchers, they waved those flaming torches, and they shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." And they instantly awoke the sleeping enemies. Then they blew the trumpets, making the loudest noise they can make. When those startled Midianites awoke and they saw these torches and they heard this loud noise, they panicked. Imagine what you would do in that situation. Wake up and there's people surrounding you, all kinds of noise, just chaos going on. That's what these Midianites woke up to, and they panicked. They thought they were surrounded by a powerful army. They thought there were 32,000 people surrounding them, but they didn't know it was just 300. Verse 22 says, "When the 300 blew the trumpets, the Lord set every man's sword against his companion throughout the whole camp." The Midianites took themselves out. The Israelites, they didn't have to lift a sword. All they had to do was blow those trumpets and hold those flaming torches. And God took care of the rest. All they had to do was what God told them to do. And God took care of everything else. The Midianites turned against one another, killed one another, and those who survived fled for their lives. Gideon and those 300 people were victorious, and God was once again able to be honored in Israel. Many years ago, when a lot of young men were enlisting and being drafted, there was a man who was a student in a Bible college preparing to be a preacher. Some of his former classmates were very critical of him for not enlisting. They accused him of ducking his duty and taking the coward's way out. One day, this man approached his group of former classmates, and one of the classmates said, "Here comes the chicken. He went off to Bible college because he's afraid to fight for his country." The man straightened his 6'2" frame up and his 200-pound body, and he replied, "I joined an army that the rest of you don't have the guts to join." It takes courage to enlist in the Lord's army. It takes courage to live an opposite life of what the world tells us we should live. And we've got to have that courage and live that life. What enemies are you facing in your life? What's made you feel like you're defeated and discouraged? Perhaps today is the time to take a stand. I want you to know that if you take a stand, that God's going to be there with you, just as He was with Gideon and the Israelites. He'll help you fight your battles. You may say, who, me? If God is with me, then why am I going through all these things in my life? I'm sure some people think that. But God is calling you to victory just as He did with Gideon. He's calling you to leave your doubt, and He's calling you to walk in faith. He's calling you to be a doer and not a complainer. We keep wanting God to do something without our help. We keep wanting somebody else to do something for us. But God wants to use you. He wants you. He doesn't want other people to fight your battles. He wants you and Him to fight your battles. God called Gideon a mighty warrior early on in chapter 6. But that's not who Gideon was at that time. That's not who Gideon was at first. He was not a mighty warrior. But it was who he would become with the help of God. God looked at Gideon's potential rather than looking at Gideon's weaknesses. And that's what God is doing now if you allow Him to. If you walk in faith and do what He's calling you to do, He's going to see your potential rather than those weaknesses. And He's going to bless you greatly. If you've lost your trust in the Lord, then tonight's the time to give that trust back to God. Tonight's the time to make a change. If you need prayers of the church, or if you'd like to be baptized into Christ this evening, please make that known tonight as we stand and as we sing.
Have thine affections been nailed to the cross?